Should the 3D printer decide what you're allowed to make? Should a slicer scan your files before you even hit print? Should a machine you bought become your moral gatekeeper? That's not dystopian future. This is an actual legislative proposal. A bill in Washington state would require 3D printers to include mandatory blocking software to prevent your printer from printing certain firearm-related parts. But before you decide this is tyranny or this is just common sense, I think both sides arguing on the wrong level. Let me explain that. The bill proposes that manufacturers must integrate non-removable software that detects and blocks certain firearm-related parts. It doesn't simply regulate behavior, it puts enforcement into the machine itself. Think about what that means. Somewhere, someone, or more realistically an entire office, needs to maintain and constantly update a library of forbidden geometries, keeping up with the entire maker community, engineers, open source designers, industrial R&D, hobbyists, companies, in a field that evolves weekly. We've all seen how long it takes to update a textbook, and physics doesn't reinvent itself every 5 minutes. Now imagine keeping a master list of shapes in an open design ecosystem. Digital files make weapon production easier, distribution is global, access is easier than ever before. This concern isn't irrational. Digital systems scale, and scale matters. But then, the question isn't if there is risk, it's where enforcement belongs. One of the biggest strengths of 3D printing is its creative freedom. Geometry isn't classical geometry. Parts don't have to look like specific parts. It can be abstract, transformable, modular. But how does a universal detection algorithm distinguish intent in a system built on creativity and abstraction? If it's too broad, it will miss a lot of cases. If it's too narrow, it will block legitimate engineering work. But that's just how pattern recognition works. So let's zoom out. But if we decide that universal tools must prevent misuse, where does that logic end? Should my CAD system refuse to save certain data? Should my operating system scan every file I have for dangerous shapes? We don't do that in any other digital domain. For example, digital piracy is illegal, yet Windows doesn't verify the license of every media file before opening it. Media players aren't required to become copyright enforcement devices. We regulate distribution platforms, we prosecute large-scale violators, and we enforce behavior. We don't turn every personal computer into a compliance checkpoint. Actually, we tried embedding enforcement into devices before. In the early 2000s, the music industry faced a massive problem. Piracy was exploding. Napster, peer-to-peer networks, MP3 sharing everywhere. The solution many companies pursued was digital rights management, DRM. Files were locked, players checked permissions, devices restricted copying and sharing. The scope what needed to be detected was incredibly narrow: copyrighted songs. And even with that clearly defined target, embedding enforcement into devices did not eliminate piracy. What it did is frustrate users and limit legitimate use. Over time, enforcement shifted away from hardwiring morality into end-user devices towards distribution bottlenecks. iTunes, streaming services, sharing platforms, where the data was shared. The lesson wasn't that enforcement doesn't work. The lesson was that enforcement works on distribution bottlenecks. And that was in a domain where the thing being detected, copyrighted music, was very narrowly definable. Now imagine that in an open-ended design space like digital manufacturing. PCBWay is very renowned for their PCB manufacturing capabilities. They also offer industrial-grade 3D printing, and with worldwide shipping it will show up within days on your doorstep. Earlier I said 3D printing is about creativity. Geometry does not always transport intent. Files can be transformed, modular, repurposed. So an algorithm that detects is either overly broad or it relies on human review. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Who wants human review in a machine they privately own? Constant connectivity, file scanning, and maybe someone accessing your machine with a camera? Human moderation makes sense on centralized platform, but it becomes very invasive on a machine you privately own. But this is a dangerous precedent. Today 3D printers, tomorrow CAD systems, and after that, everything. But let's be honest, regulation exists for a reason. Regulation and restrictions are oftentimes in place to protect people, to prevent harm, to prevent someone from ignoring common sense just to make a quick buck. In medical 3D printing, for example, we didn't just start to print implants. We built compliance systems, traceability, audits, and nobody called that oppression because harm was real. So the real question isn't regulation versus freedom, it's where regulation belongs. Most systems regulate one of three ways: regulate the tool, regulate distribution, or regulate behavior and misbehavior. Running a red light is illegal, but your car will not refuse to do it. Your motor will not shut off. We regulate the driver, not the machine. Digital piracy is illegal, but we don't regulate that every media player has to check for copyright enforcement. We regulate distribution and enforce behavior. We normally don't make our devices into moral gatekeepers. We typically regulate products when their intended use has inherent risks. An airbag, for example, creates a risk if it does not work correctly when it's used. A medical implant creates risks just by interacting with the human body. But when harm arises primarily from misuse, society tends to regulate distribution and prosecute behavior, not the neutral tool itself. A 3D printer's intended use is manufacturing, not violence. This bill is not the end of freedom. It's just a proposal. This is how democracies work. That friction, that's not failure, that's the system working. And the fact that 3D printing is debated on a legislative level has an important message. 3D printing is not a niche hobby anymore. It's a serious manufacturing technology. I'm not against regulation. I'm against regulation that targets the wrong layer. Universal tools should not be universal gatekeepers. If we regulate, let's make it where it's technically viable and where it makes sense. So the real question is not freedom against safety. It's whether we place the responsibility in the correct place. So let me know in the comment what you think about. Legislative designs. Yeah. I said digital systems. I'm like drunk. We typically, that's a hard word to say. We usually, that's even hard, usually. We typically regulate products. We typically, why are you laughing again? We typically, you bastard, no. We typically, stop it.